Like most bikes, the small KTM Dukes have an automatic camchain tensioner. Sometimes you need to remove it. On these later bikes, it's a little more difficult than it was on the early bikes, but it's easy enough if you know a couple of little tricks. So I'll show you how it works. The camchain tensioner sits on the right hand side of the bike, just above the clutch. Behind the trellis of the frame here, we have the cylinder, and on the back is the camchain tensioner. Now I have a new one that I'm going to use for demonstration purposes, and this is what it looks like. So this is this sitting in here. There is a sprung bar that sticks into the engine, and this end here that has some movement in it pushes against the camchain and applies tension. Now these can fail. Some people like to replace this with a manual tensioner. A manual version is much the same as this in terms of this, but instead of having a sprung mounted bar here, it's just a screwed in bar, and you screw it in and you tighten it up when you're happy with it. Although there is a risk that an automatic tensioner will fail, in the last 20 years nearly every manufacturer has moved to fit these, and the reason is quite simple: that manual tensioners don't get adjusted enough by the average rider, and that results in more engine failures than failures of an automatic tensioner. Manual tensioners are nowadays used for race applications, and they're good with an engine that you're constantly fiddling with, taking apart and rebuilding, where you can check the tension is exactly where you want it. For the average rider, I don't recommend them. I recommend you stick with an automatic tensioner. The chances of failure are very low. The chances of forgetting to properly adjust or not properly adjusting your manual tensioner are more likely to destroy your engine than a failing automatic tensioner. So what we've got here is there is a bolt which runs into here. It's removed at the moment so you can get to the adjuster, and there are two bolts. So all we need to do is to unwind these two bolts, and this pulls out. The problem on these is that it's not quite that easy. The problem with removing this is especially this bolt here, because what we have here is the throttle body, and on the ride-by-wire throttle bodies, this side of it is much bigger because it's not just being pulled by the cable with a little pulley here. Inside here there's a mechanism that so that as you turn the throttle with your hand, this then turns and opens the valve inside of the throttle body, and it comes across and it blocks this screw, so you can't get the screw out. In order to get this screw out, we need to move the throttle body out of the way, and that's simple enough. But the first thing we can do before we start is to remove this cover bolt in the middle. So we are just unscrewing this from here, and down in the center here there is a small screw which a screwdriver will slot into it. Your second issue you've got is that there really isn't much room. So before you even consider this, you need to make sure that you've got a screwdriver which will actually fit down inside and be able to turn the screw. So if you do have one, make sure it's in there and a tight fit, because we don't want to damage the screw inside of here. So make sure it's a good fit, and then we turn it to the right until it stops. Let me demonstrate what's happening. When you turn this screw in, we'll turn it around because I'm right-handed. When you turn this screw in to the right, it winds the adjuster back in until it stops and it locks. So now it's locked back, and that's what we want to achieve, is to have that back in the fully retracted, locked position. If you buy a new one of these, KTM will sell a little plastic screwdriver that will also sit and lock into these slots here to make sure that it can't come undone. And obviously, if you have one of these, then you can actually reach down inside there, but it is quite stiff, so I prefer to use a proper screwdriver for doing that. And also, before starting it, make sure you've got a new gasket that's going to go in so you don't get any oil leaks. So with that fully locked back in, we can remove or loosen these two screws here. Mind your paintwork. This one you can get out with a socket. This one, if you do put a ring spanner on it, once you've loosened it, you won't be able to get the ring spanner off. So loosen it with the flats and you will be able to work it out. But what you won't be able to do is to get this screw all the way out, and it has to come all the way out in order to remove this. Now there is a little bit of flex in the throttle body, but not enough. Let's move around to the other side of the bike so that we can actually move that out of the way. So on this side of the bike, you've got a plastic cover here, you've got the exhaust pipe here, and down in there, there is a clamp, and this is the clamp where to hold the throttle body into this rubber boot which connects to the engine. Now there is another clamp further up. Don't remove that one. You want to loosen this one, and this is a 3. So we want to remove this or loosen this clamp off enough to be able to move the clamp out of the way. Be careful with this, because in the center of the clamp there is a tube. Now that clamp has a set position on the throttle body. In order to tighten this up, you'll need to move this back out the way, but that spacer here, which stops the clamp being over tightened, will drop out the way. So be careful with that, and it helps to have a magnet when you come to it, because there really isn't enough room in there to get your fingers in there. Let's go back to the other side. With that clamp released, we have now got some movement in the throttle body. It's not a lot, and we don't want to dislodge the throttle body too much because we want to make sure it maintains a seal, but we've got enough movement in it that we can undo the screw and wiggle it out. Now you might get this out without loosening that clamp, but honestly it's so easy to loosen that clamp that it's worth doing. So we can now remove both of these, and we can now pull out this. Now it's going to be a bit stuck to the engine because it's stuck on the gasket. I'm not going to pull this out on this video simply because I will be doing this again in the not too distant future, and I don't want to have to buy another gasket. Once you've knocked it loose from the gasket, just tap it. Don't try and gouge this. It's just the gasket is stuck. So gently release it. You'll be able to pull it out. As you pull it out, you can actually turn this, which will give you the room, because at the moment it's sitting like this. You can turn this, and that will allow it to slide past the throttle body. Again, you can push the throttle body out the way as it comes, and then you can take this out. Once you've got this out, you can do whatever you want to do with it. You can replace it. You can put in a manual tensioner. Manual tensioners normally go in until they touch, and then it's normally half turn more or something similar, and then lock it off. use the instructions that come with your tensioner, or you can just put a new one in if you're concerned it's faulty, and that's it. So once you've done that, you can put your bolts back in. I'm not going to bother giving any torque values for these because they're quite light, and in any case you're unlikely to be able to get a torque wrench in here. It's a little bit of fiddling to get the screw in. Tighten these down. Don't lean on them. They are just small steel bolts into alloy, and they will strip and damage if you put too much force. So just a little bit on there. I recommend you get a torch and you look down inside to see which direction the screw head is sitting, and then once you've turned it and released it, you make sure that it has actually moved. It won't move very much in all probability, or at least mine doesn't, but that's enough to release the lock. Now, you can see that when it goes fully tight, it just locks it, and once you've moved it a little bit, it will release and it will tension as much as it needs. And that's all there is to changing that. So put the cover screw back in. That keeps a seal on the engine and it will keep the dirt from going back in. This is only a 5 Newton meters if I remember rightly. So again, don't overdo it. But of course, one more job, and that's to put the clamp back on the throttle body. Get a torch and make sure that that throttle body is fully seated down inside the rubber here. Make sure that when we were moving it around it didn't come out, because if we did, we'll get air leaks. Make sure it's sitting in the groove at the top. Make sure the throttle body is firmly seated in, and there's a little rubber tab sticks out in the groove, and there's a notched piece on the clamp that goes over it. It'll be obvious when you look at it. Make sure that's all tightened up, and then it's job done. And that's all there is to changing out the automatic Camchain tensioner on the small Dukes. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.